Radio Free Maine presents Noam Chomsky, speaking on breaking the myth, an expose of the exploitative mechanisms that underlie the international political economy. February 13, 1996, Brandeis University, Waltham, Massachusetts.
The title that was announced is a rather tall order, and I can't possibly try to do more than chip away at bits and pieces of it, which is what I'll do. I hope you please feel free in discussion to pick up threads or things I haven't gotten to and so on, of which there'll be many. The first point that bears mention is that any discussion of the international economic order is that it's always closely related to the domestic socio-economic order. Of course, it's related in different ways for different kinds of places. So take, say, the Western Hemisphere. I haven't actually measured, but I suppose one of the smallest countries, if that's what it is, in the Western Hemisphere is Bermuda. But even Bermuda is closely related to its internal order is closely related to the international economic order, in fact, in pretty dramatic ways. Though maybe the smallest country in the hemisphere, Bermuda happens to be the largest recipient of U.S. foreign investment in the hemisphere, foreign direct investment. In fact, last I looked, about a quarter of it went to Bermuda. Well, that's not because we're building lots of factories in Bermuda and that sort of thing. It's because Bermuda is a well-known tax haven. So if you have a lot of, if you're a bank and you want to make, or an industry or a money launderer or something like that, and you have problems where you don't want anybody to have a look at them, you invest, it's what's called investing in Bermuda. And in fact, if you add the other tax havens, like, say, the Cayman Islands and so on, you get pretty close to 50% of the total U.S. foreign direct investment in the hemisphere. So if we look at the tiniest little spots we choose, in fact, often more so in the tiniest ones, we find that their domestic economy happens to be linked in quite intriguing ways that are worth pursuing to the international economy. Well, going to the other extreme in the hemisphere, the United States is far and away the richest and most powerful country, in fact, in the world. In fact, there isn't really any historical parallel to it. So turn to the United States. Here, there's all kinds of links between the domestic socioeconomic order and the international political economy. One of those links, which is particularly worth noting, is one that was actually, in the case of the United States, it's plainly going to be overwhelming because of its power. The same was true of England before it. But in the case of the United States, particularly since 1945, though the richest and most powerful country in the world long before, in fact, by the turn of the century, had by far the largest economy in the world, it wasn't really until the Second World War that the United States became a major player in the international scene. In fact, the designer of the post-war international order, as the United States, out of self-interest, assumed responsibility for the welfare of the world capitalist system. Actually, those words aren't mine. I'm quoting a well-known diplomatic historian, Gerald Haynes, who also happens to be senior historian of the CIA, in an important and highly respected and interesting book on the U.S. and Latin America and the post-war order. And the comment is correct. The United States did assume out of self-interest responsibility for the welfare of the world capitalist system. Actually, it's only almost correct. To make it actually correct, we have to add a correction that traces back, I don't know how far, but at least as far as Adam Smith, someone we're taught to revere and worship, but not to read, which is a mistake because he's interesting to read. One of the things he pointed out in Wealth of Nations is that there's no such thing as wealth of nations. It doesn't make any sense. Rather, nation, you have to, in order to discuss the wealth of England, which is his primary interest, obviously, over 200 years ago, where he lived, you have to do what's later called class analysis. You have to recognize that England isn't an entity. Rather, as he put it, the merchants and manufacturers, who were the principal architects of state policy in England, made sure that their own interests were most peculiarly attended to, no matter how grievous the impact on others, and particularly in the colonies, but also the people of England. And that corrects, that's necessary, that truism, which is what it ought to be, comes right up into the present. In fact, it's only in fairly recent years that these words have been completely unspeakable. So to take the leading American social philosopher of the 20th century, John Dewey, who's incidentally right out of mainstream America, about as American as apple pie in the famous phrase. For him, it was equally a truism that politics, in his words, is the shadow cast by big business over society. And if you do things that attenuate the shadow, you won't really affect the substance. You won't change very much. And that required, as he felt, and this again goes way back in American history, it requires democratic control of investment decisions and commerce, and in fact every aspect of life, industrial democracy, or else you're going to have only very limited democracy. Well, these are truisms. American workers in their independent press around here 150 years ago were writing that sort of thing without the benefit of any radical intellectuals, and they're truisms because they're obvious. So I apologize to you for saying what's obvious. But what's obvious is that when we talk about England or the United States or whatever, we have to ask whether we're talking about the principal architects of policy and the substance that casts the shadow. In Adam Smith's days, the merchants and manufacturers. In our days, huge transnational corporations and financial institutions. And they play their own game, and they're the ones. So making that correction to Haynes's comment, what in fact happened is that after the Second World War, the masters of the domestic economy in the United States, out of self-interest, assumed responsibility for the welfare of the financial and industrial institutions of corporate state capitalism. And they determined to use the state power that they could control the shadow that they cast for their own ends, however grievous the impact on others, including rather often their own population. Well, a lot of modern history actually follows almost directly from these truisms, and when we make these slight corrections, we begin at least to approach the real world, as seen incidentally from a rather conservative perspective. I haven't been quoting far-out radicals, but actually the most conservative traditional thinkers. When you go to a radical critique, it's much sharper and more far-reaching, but I'll keep to the conservative side of the spectrum here. Going to the U.S.-dominated global economic order that was crafted after World War II, the United States was in a position of unparalleled domination and wealth and military force and everything else, and its planners knew it, and they designed a world to an extent that had never been seen before. And one of their goals, as they assumed responsibility for the welfare of financial and industrial corporations, was one of the effects was, not surprisingly, that the design that they laid out led to an enormous growth of overseas investment, and in fact was the base, the groundwork for the contemporary multinational corporation. At first they were mostly American, just for reasons of wealth and power. Gradually, as Europe and Japan reconstructed from the war and in part went their own ways, there's a distribution reflecting power. They're still primarily American. U.S., that is, not American in a broader sense. About 25 years ago, there were substantial changes in this international order, in fact, about the only major changes since 1945, and they led to a still closer integration of the international and the domestic socioeconomic orders, a phenomenon that's sometimes called globalization. Here the connections are of a different sort. I'll get to them. But when we look at the international order and we look at the United States, we increasingly find similar structures because something is indeed getting internationalized. In fact, what I think is getting internationalized, and I'll come back to this, is a kind of third world model. If you take any third world society, you pick it, they always have basically the same structure. There's a small sector of great wealth and opulence, sometimes extraordinary. There's a large mass of people who are somewhere between suffering and total misery, and there's a big superfluous population who you just don't have much to do with. They don't contribute to wealth production, so you get rid of them somehow. Death squads, kick them out into the desert, one trick or another. And the United States is coming more and more to resemble that. I'll come back to it. Same with Britain, and in a globalized economy, everyone gets dragged along at their own pace. This is nothing about markets or anything like that. It's perfectly conscious and perfectly natural social policy on the part of the masters, on the part of who, again, to quote Adam Smith, will, as he knew and said, follow what he called their vile maxim, namely, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. That's natural. And if you have to the extent that the masters of mankind have the power to implement that social policy, that's precisely what any rational person, at least the good old-fashioned conservative like Adam Smith, would take for granted. So that's, in my view, what the globalization is, and I'll be coming back to it as we proceed. Well, about 25 years ago, the globalization, which isn't new, it goes back hundreds of years, but takes different forms, it took a new form, a different form, slightly different, not so slightly, significantly different form, around 1970. There were a lot of reasons for it, and no time to talk about them. I'll come back if you want. But basically, the crucial thing that happened is that part of the design of the post-World War system was no longer sustainable by the masters of the American economy. It was very beneficial to them. It was organized in a way which was highly beneficial to them. One of the things that was beneficial was, and this is the central point, was the regulated financial market. International currencies were regulated after World War II. That's part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And they were regulated in such a way as to make the dollar more or less the international, make the U.S. the international bank. So the dollar was, you could use for anything. Everything's geared to the dollar. The dollar was fixed relative to gold. The United States had most of the gold at the time. And other currencies were regulated relative to the dollar. In fact, the earliest role of the famous IMF was to deal with sort of these slight adjustments in currencies that were made when there were recessions and this and that and the other. It's changed a lot since then. Well, that was the international economy up until 1970, the core of it, the financial core of it. And that role for the dollar, making the United States, the world's banker, was to a large extent, was very beneficial to U.S.-based industry and corporations. In fact, was a large part of the reason for the vast expansion of U.S.-based, later other multinational corporate structures. However, by around 1970, it was becoming harder and more costly to the United States to, again, when I say United States, I mean the decision-making sector, the principal architects of policy, in Smith's words. The United States is a shorthand. It was becoming harder for them to sustain this role, and when you rule the world, you make the rules, so they just said the game's over. Richard Nixon just unilaterally dismantled the post-war international economic order. He broke the connection between the dollar and gold, and international financial markets were within 2 or 3 years deregulated. There was a theory around at that time called free market capitalism, and according to free market theory, this was going to be terrific. It was going to stabilize everything would be regulated, best of all possible worlds. What turned out was a little bit different. It's caused total chaos in financial markets, sharp, what's called by international economists sometimes a casino economy with enormous fluctuations and busts and booms and all sorts of wild things going on, exactly the opposite of what was predicted. But things did change in many ways, crucial ways. In fact, some of them the way they were predicted. One thing that changed is simply a huge explosion of financial capital in the world. I mean, it's just shot up to astronomical scale. Last time the World Bank tried to do a measure, which is not so simple, it's really hard to trace. About 2 years ago, they estimated about $14 trillion, of which about $1 trillion a day moves from one exchange to another. It crosses, moves around. It's mostly, an awful lot of it is being used for speculation against currencies, very small-scale speculation. That's why when you go to a place like MIT, where they have corporate recruiters coming around, in May or June to pick up the hotshot PhDs in mathematics and physics, they used to come from General Electric and so on, but last year 25% of them came from Wall Street, looking for mathematics and physics PhDs who may not know anything about Wall Street, but can figure out all sorts of complicated scams that you can use for minuscule shifting around of this $1 trillion a day to make a little money, and on the side destroy economies and so on and so forth. Same thing's happening in England, where they're going to Oxford and Cambridge for the PhDs for the same reason. Well, if you go back to, not only did the amount of speculative capital in international exchanges explode in scale, but it also changed radically in character. So around 1970, it was estimated, these numbers are a little rough, that's their estimates, but the standard estimate was that about 90% of the capital in international exchanges was related to the real economy. It was for investment or commerce or something like that. About 10% was speculative. By 1990, after less than 20 years, those figures had reversed. About 10% was real economy related, 90% was speculative. The last figures that were put out by the UNCTAD, UN Economic Monitoring Agency, it was 1994, I think. It was 95% speculative and 5% real economy. Others give slightly different numbers, but qualitatively that's standard estimate. And that's of a far bigger pool than in 1970 because of this huge explosion that I mentioned. Well, as I say, some of the predictions worked out the opposite of the way they were supposed to, but some of them worked out as was predicted. So early on, in fact, in the late 70s, it was already recognized by at least the economists with their eyes open where this stuff was going. In 1978, the presidential address at the American Economic Association was given by James Tobin, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, well-known economist. It was on this topic, and he pointed out that the effect of this, by then already obvious, huge growth in speculative capital was going to drive the world towards a low-growth, low-wage equilibrium, also very high profit. Because this money is looking for low growth. You can see that when you read the business pages. Growth terrifies financial markets, or unemployment rises, stocks go up, and that sort of thing. And there are good reasons for that, which are well understood. So he predicted that we would be moving towards low growth, period of low growth, and low wages, and he didn't say it, but high profits, which means sharper inequalities, in fact, the move towards what in fact is a third world structure, which is pretty much what's been happening for the past 20 years, very dramatically so. There was recently a study a couple of years ago run by Paul Volcker, who was the head of the Federal Reserve under Reagan, which tried to look into the fact, it's well known that growth has lowered since that point. Growth's been international growth has been, economic growth has been considerably lower since that time. And they estimated that about half of the decline in growth rates was just due to the increase in the flow of speculative financial capital. Tobin also had a proposal as to what to do about this, rather simple-minded but straightforward proposal. That is that you put a tax on short-term speculative transfers, like speculation against currencies, short-term transfers of the kind that are exploding. If you put a slight tax if you put a tax on them, it'll slow down the exchange. The bigger the tax, the more it'll slow it down. He guessed, and others have tried to work it out, that a small tax would in fact slow it down enough so you'd have more capital going into the real economy, not just driving the economy down, which is what this stuff is doing. It's been called the Tobin tax ever since then. It's been on the UN agenda since that time, but not hadn't been a major success, to put it mildly. Although there have been some calculations as to what the consequences would be. They're pretty rough, like all the numbers that are thrown around. One recent estimate is that if you had a tax of 0.5% on speculative flows, it's quite small, it would yield on the order of $1.5 trillion a year. To give you a sense of what some of these numbers mean, U.S. gross domestic product is around $7 trillion a year, of which 1/7, that is about $1 trillion, is spent on marketing. Marketing means deceit and manipulation. And furthermore, this roughly $1 trillion on marketing is for the most part tax deductible, which means that the population pays for the privilege of being propagandized. And that's, so those are just as a background to sort of think what scale we're talking about. Against that background, there's an estimate of, $1.5 trillion plus or minus some measure, which would come from a very small Tobin tax, 0.5% on transfers. And that would also have whatever effect it would have on slowing down the weapons that are driving the world down to low growth and low wages and sharp inequalities. Well, just to see what you could do with $1.5 trillion a year, pursuing the estimates, that would eliminate the annual debt payment for the third world. Incidentally, the debts are going up, not down, as they pay off a hopeless amount of inequality debt. So they're about like 50% higher now than before the whole debt service relief program began about 15 years ago. So $1.5 trillion a year would eliminate not the debt, but the debt repayments, which are a huge burden on most of the world. They would provide basic health care to the whole population of the world, which would, it's estimated, for example, cut infant mortality by about 50%. These are, here too, the numbers are not trivial. UNICEF, in its latest report, estimated that the number of children who die from easily treatable diseases, like a little bit of salt or something, has risen from 11 million a year, which is what it was the previous year, to 13 million a year. And they could be saved for pennies a day, according to the UNICEF estimate, if the masters of mankind didn't have something else on their mind. This same $1.5 trillion could also provide universal access to safe drinking water, which most of the world doesn't have, and which is an enormous factor in death and disease and misery and so on. It could provide primary education for the whole world, including literacy, specifically for women who are out of the system in most of the world. Also family planning, and it's a well-known fact that family planning, women's literacy, women's rights in general, is the major factor that leads to decline in fertility. So one estimate is this would maybe stabilize the world's population in another 10 or 15 years. We're still talking about what comes from a tiny Tobin tax, and that would leave 90% of that $1.5 trillion untouched. That is usable for other purposes, which one can think about, at the same time weakening very powerful weapons, which are used against growth and development and welfare and so on, here as elsewhere. Well, as I say, this idea hasn't gotten very far. The financial institutions won't hear of it for obvious reasons, and they're pretty powerful. However, there is an interesting question as to why the manufacturing corporations aren't interested, because it would probably benefit them. That is, it would increase profits, presumably, if more capital went into, say, manufacturing and trade and less into financial speculation. So how come they're not in favor of it? They have a fair amount of clout, too. That has interested some international political economists. One of the best is David Felix, who had an article about it in one of the recent economic journals. And he offered what I think is a plausible speculation. He said, yeah, it's true, the Tobin tax would probably be profitable for industrial corporations, but they have a certain class interest that overrides profit, namely smashing people in the face. That is, it's extremely important for them to undermine and destroy democratic forms, to reduce most of the population to, penury and suffering, and to concentrate wealth among the very narrow fringe of the super wealthy, where of course they are. And that kind of class interest, he argued, probably overrides the short-term profit interest. That is, one of the effects of this slow growth is you got to cut social spending, or you don't have to, of course, but that's the line. The line is you got to cut social spending because, after all, growth is low, and so on and so forth. And cutting social spending means cutting those parts of governments, meaning people's tax money, that goes to the general population. It's kind of like a small footnote, is you not keep, but you expand the parts that go to the rich, but I'll come back to that. Anyhow, it's been a terrific weapon against social spending in the United States, in England, and increasingly in the rest of the world, in Sweden, and so on. Profits are shooting up, but social spending is going down. And this lowering of growth is largely an ideological weapon that is used to carry out those useful tasks. So it's worth doing this, even if, in fact, it harms profits. That's not unreasonable. I think if you look at modern history, as far back as we can go, in fact, but surely in the modern period, you can find many times when the class interest of increasing inequality or undermining democratic forms or eliminating social spending and so on has, in fact, overridden the interest of short-term maximization of profit. There are many interesting examples of that. I'll come back to some more. So that's a speculation, but I think Felix's speculation is not at all implausible. Anyway, the Tobin tax is not on the agenda in the real world, though it's technically on the agenda and has been for a long time in the UN, and economists talk about it, and other people who think about these things. Well, that was one thing that happened, and that's a pretty conservative proposal. He's not suggesting, like what I would suggest, that financial institutions are totally illegitimate and should be dismantled. He's just saying something small, put a 0.5% tax on their currency transfers. So as I say, I'm keeping to the conservative end of the spectrum. Another change that took place around 25 years ago, which was important, was the beginning of what sometimes is called the telecommunications revolution, which you know about, and that has been very expeditious in making it possible to do things like transfer $1 trillion around a day between capital markets, like, say, taking virtually the entire New York Stock Exchange capital and putting it in Tokyo every day, so you can, and then back, so that you can take advantage of the daytime hours in the two countries which are opposite, things like that. Telecommunications has been a big contributor to this. In fact, if you look at the big news agencies, like, say, there are really only three left: Reuters, Associated Press, which is Dow Jones, so AP Dow Jones, and Knight Ridder. I think that's virtually there are some smaller ones, but that's the main ones. News is one of their least useful, one of the commodities that they're least interested in at this point. I mean, they do distribute news, but the main thing that they distribute is information to investors. Reuters, for example, or AP Dow Jones, I mean, what they do is the reporters, like if, say, the president's giving a speech, right, and what the reporter is supposed to do is to see if there's some hint in the speech as to whether maybe there'll be a slight stimulus to the economy, or maybe taxes will drop or something or other. And the minute the reporter picks that up, he races out with his portable telephone, screaming into it and talking to some central computer somewhere and saying the president said X, and then the guy types it out on the computer. It goes all over the world, and $1 trillion a day starts moving around because various people think they can make a little money by moving the money from here to there, and so on and so forth. On the side, there's some news that dribbles out. That's sort of news. That's more and more a reflection of these developments. Anyway, the growth of the telecommunications industry was a big fact of the technology and so on. It didn't have to be used for this purpose, of course. Technology doesn't care what it's used for. It reflects power interests. It has expedited these developments very significantly. A third thing that happened more or less independently about the same time, but contributed to the same tendencies, was the huge sudden explosion in commodity prices. Now, the one that made all the headlines was oil price, which about quadrupled early in the 70s. Actually, fewer headlines were given to the fact that coal prices, which coal is mostly a U.S.-based export, they went up by a factor of 8 the year before oil prices went up, and other U.S. exports like grain also went up, and so on. But the one that was important to the masters of mankind was the oil prices. So we all talk about the oil sheiks and all the terrible things they did. Well, anyway, one of the things that happened with the rise of oil prices was that a huge amount of capital got poured into international exchanges in interesting ways, if you look. A large part of that increase in profits went straight to the energy companies. The energy company, because their profits went up even faster than the oil price. Well, the energy companies are U.S.-based or else British-based for the most part. So that's all money coming back to the United States and Britain. Again, every time I say these words, you'll remember who I mean. A little sector of the United States and Britain. So the rise in oil, in fact, it was rather welcome. If you look back, you'll notice that the U.S. did not make efforts to try to get the price down. In fact, it was basically telling other countries, lay off, we don't mind. And it's not surprising that the U.S. and Britain didn't mind, because this was very beneficial to them. Not only in pouring money back to the U.S. and secondarily British-based energy companies, but also into making it profitable for them to open up more expensive oil resources, which they'd always known about and could have developed, but with less profit. But as the prices shifted, it became profitable to open up North Sea oil and Alaska oil. And they happen to be British and American, mostly American. So that's another big benefit to the U.S. and secondarily British economies. Also Norway and a couple other people gained by it, but they're the big. U.S. is the big player, and Britain, its little puppy dog, is the second player. In addition to that, a tremendous amount of its capital went straight into U.S. Treasury securities. The family dictatorships that are the local managers of the oil resources, they know their job. Their job was determined years and years ago. The British Foreign Office back during World War I, when the British recognized they just didn't have the troops any longer to hold the empire, by force, worked out some other ways of doing it. And one of the ways they worked out was to, as they put it, set up what they called an Arab facade that would manage things behind British rule. And it would manage behind what they called various constitutional fictions, like, buffer state or this, that, and the other thing. The Arab facade has a task. Its task is to make sure that the wealth of the region does not go to the people of the region, but rather goes to the West, meaning the United States and Britain. Since the people of the region are, in fact, if you look at where Western oil investment has most taken place, it's mostly in places with very low local populations. So there's plenty of petroleum in India, but it wasn't high priority. On the other hand, the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia and Emirates, that's a great place, as long as you can make sure that the people of the region don't get any funny ideas. Like, maybe people in the slums in Cairo or somewhere don't understand exactly why all the wealth of that region has to go to rich investors in London and New York. Well, that's why you have powerful gendarmes, regional policemen, local cops on the beat, as the Nixon administration put it, to sort of hit them over the head if they don't get the idea. And then there's British and American force and reserve in case things really get into trouble. That's basically the system which the U.S. took over from the British. And the Arab facade, the local family dictatorships, they're allowed to get wealthy themselves. And in fact, they can be as corrupt and brutal and whatever they like. They can be Islamic fundamentalist fanatics, and then nobody really cares, as long as they do their job and make sure that the profits from oil flow to the West, not to the people of the region. And they did. That's why Saudi Arabian funds poured into treasury securities, and also huge purchases of things like U.S. arms or big, huge construction projects, Bechtel Corporation and all that sort of thing. All that is just ways of recycling petrodollars back to where they belong, in the same banks where they started from. In fact, there was a huge flow of funds during that period from one bank account in Chase Manhattan and Citibank to another bank account, either there or in the next bank down the street. And these were some of the mechanisms. Another mechanism that was used to recycle money through Western financial institutions, mainly U.S. and secondarily British, was the Third World debt. The World Bank, in its wisdom, advised Third World dictatorships that the best way to develop is to borrow lots and lots of money. Which then, of course, stays in the banks because they then purchase treasury securities or, arms or something or other. And that was a nice arrangement. It led to the Third World debt and the debt crisis when the whole thing collapsed, as it was obviously going to do. It collapsed mainly because U.S. interest rates shot up in the early 80s. And at that point, something had to be done. So the obvious thing was done. The debt burden was shifted to the vast majority of the population in the Third World, and all of a sudden, countries became not the little sector that rules things and profits, but rather the rest of them who get beaten over the head. That's the country, and they're the ones who have to pay for it. So the payment of the debt falls on the large majority, who had absolutely nothing to do with it and gained nothing from it. The debt is then paid to the guys who got rich in the first place, and the local elites, who of course always profit. They're part of the same system. They're doing just fine. Some of the debt was not payable. So you had to do something about that. The way that was handled was to socialize it in the rich countries. So American taxpayers and so on, they pick up the debt in one or another form as the manipulations in effect socialize it. This tells you another crucial lesson about what's called capitalism. It has to be risk-free. You're allowed to make a lot of profits, but the nanny state has to move in and protect you in case you get into any trouble. The debt crisis is a perfectly good example. The S&L collapse is another one. What just happened in Mexico is another one. The Mexican economic miracle was a transparent fraud. It was obvious that it was going to collapse, and apparently to everyone except the World Bank economists and other professionals. But it was perfectly obvious it was going to collapse. The only question was when. When it did, you got to make sure that the big American investment firms, like the people who staff Clinton's cabinet, it's hard to make these distinctions, they have to, Goldman Sachs is supposed to make money, not take risks. So there's a huge public payoff, which is called payments to Mexico, but is in fact payments to U.S. investors and the firms that handle their accounts. That's another part of the free market miracle, and there's thousands of similar examples. Well, that's the debt. all of this, to go back, these major factors, the deregulation of international financial markets, the telecommunications revolution, the huge increase in the amount of capital flowing around the world, partly caused by the sudden rise in commodity prices, and certainly it's way down now for oil, all of these had a big effect. The major effect that they had was to put very powerful weapons into the hands of the principal architects of policy, the people who are called countries when you study international affairs and political science and so on. They're called the United States or, Somalia or something like that. But in fact, or maybe Bermuda, but in fact it's not referring to that, as, say, was obvious to Adam Smith, to pick a flaming radical. Well, it put powerful weapons into their hands, and they used it. The transnational corporations and financial institutions, who are the principal architects of policy and who cast the shadow called politics, they use the power exactly as any rational person would expect them to. So they might think a little bit about scale here too. Fortune magazine every year lists the Fortune 500 once a year, top 500 corporations. The last time around, last May, the top 500, which were rich, unprecedented profits, they were just euphoric about the fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth of 54% last year. After 4 straight years, nobody had ever heard of that. They controlled at that point close to 2/3 of gross domestic product and most of the international economy. That's, again, hard to measure, but to give you a World Bank estimate, sales of foreign subsidiaries, meaning subsidiary of Ford Motor Company in Indonesia or someplace, sales of foreign subsidiaries of transnationals was far higher than the total of world trade. That's just sales of foreign subsidiaries. Incidentally, what's called trade is another term that you ought to look into and covers a number of myths. About 50% of what's called U.S. trade happens to be internal to corporations, transactions that cross borders, but within a corporation. So, for example, when Ford Motor Company makes a car, they may do something in the United States, let's say somewhere in Michigan or wherever it's done, and then ship it across the border to northern Mexico, where you can get much, much cheaper workers, and you don't have to worry about pollution and that sort of thing. And then they, assemble pieces, and then they ship them back across the border, where you add more value, and the corporate lawyers move in and all that sort of thing. In both directions, it's called trade. Of course, it has nothing to do with trade in any market sense. These are managed, highly controlled interactions within totalitarian systems, which is what corporations are. These are huge totalitarian systems, big command economies, where the top level unites judicial and legislative and executive function, as in totalitarian states. And if you look at their structure, it's completely totalitarian, and these were truisms not very long ago. And within these totalitarian institutions, manipulations are made with a very visible hand, no invisible hand moving, and with all kinds of techniques for undermining markets and so on. And that amounts to 50% of world trade, of U.S. trade. Japan is approximately the same, and for the whole world, it's estimated roughly at around 40%. Well, these are not small proportions. There's a traditional view in economics that there's kind of like a free market sea and little tiny islands in it called business. Like everyone recognized that a mom and pop grocery store internally doesn't work by the free market. So you've got these little tiny islands around, but they're kind of footnotes, a little bit different. But if we're interested in the real world, that's where we look. So, as I say, the sales of overseas subsidiaries of transnationals far greater than world trade, but what's world trade is also, to a large extent, not trade in any meaningful sense. It's just a form of, it's part of what some economists have described as corporate mercantilism. That's a name for the whole system. You read that NAFTA and GATT and all that sort of thing are going to increase trade. Well, they're very likely to increase flows across borders. But whether they increase trade or not in any meaningful sense is another question. To answer that question, you have to do a different kind of analysis. GATT and NAFTA are not free trade agreements. They're investor rights agreements, which give more mixture of liberalization and protectionism designed to give more power to transnationals. And if one effect of that is to increase their internal interactions, that's not going to be trade in any meaningful sense. So those are things one would look at if if you're interested in the real world. There were other things happening through this period that contributed to these tendencies. One of them, fairly recent, is the end of the Cold War. Eastern Europe was the original third world. That goes back to pre-Columbian times. It was declining relative to the West from around the 15th century, and that decline continued right into this century. In fact, up till First World War for Russia and the Second World War for most of Eastern Europe. And it was standard third world relations to the first world, being the West. Resources, markets, investment opportunities, cheap labor, usual stuff. One of the rules of world order is that the service areas are not allowed to become independent. If they do, they get, they suffer. They get driven back to dependency. A second rule of world order is that they're not supposed to be economically successful. That's even worse. Then it could have a demonstration effect. Others might try to follow the same path. It's what Henry Kissinger called a virus that might infect others when he was explaining why it was necessary to overthrow the long, vibrant democratic tradition in Chile and institute the rule of a gang of murderers. He said it's a virus that might infect people all the way to southern Europe, not because the Chilean army was going to conquer Rome, but because he may not be too bright, but he understood that. It's because the Italian workers might get a bad idea, like maybe you can vote in a social democratic party or something like that. And so we have to get rid of this virus. And any form of successful NAFTA and GATT and all that sort of thing are going to increase trade. Well, they're very likely to increase flows across borders. But whether they increase trade or not in any meaningful sense is another question. To answer that question, you have to do a different kind of analysis. GATT and NAFTA are not free trade agreements. They're investor rights agreements, which give more mixture of liberalization and protectionism designed to give more power to transnationals. And if one effect of that is to increase their internal interactions, that's not going to be trade in any meaningful sense. So those are things one would look at if you're interested in the real world. There were other things happening through this period that contributed to these tendencies. One of them, fairly recent, is the end of the Cold War. Eastern Europe was the original third world. That goes back to pre-Columbian times. It was declining relative to the West from around the 15th century, and that decline continued right into this century. In fact, up till First World War for Russia and the Second World War for most of Eastern Europe. And it was standard third world relations to the first world, being the West. Resources, markets, investment opportunities, cheap labor, usual stuff. One of the rules of world order is that the service areas are not allowed to become independent. If they do, they get, they suffer. They get driven back to dependency. A second rule of world order is that they're not supposed to be economically successful. That's even worse. Then it could have a demonstration effect. Others might try to follow the same path. It's what Henry Kissinger called a virus that might infect others when he was explaining why it was necessary to overthrow the long, vibrant democratic tradition in Chile and institute the rule of a gang of murderers. He said it's a virus that might infect people all the way to southern Europe, not because the Chilean army was going to conquer Rome, but because he may not be too bright, but he understood that. It's because the Italian workers might get a bad idea, like maybe you can vote in a social democratic party or something like that. And so we have to get rid of this virus. And any form of successful development, successful in terms that influence others, is doubly or multiply dangerous. I mean, that's in fact, these are some of the guiding rules of world order. And it doesn't matter whether you're Grenada or whether you're Russia, the same rules apply. Well, the application of those rules is a large part of what's called the Cold War. The scale was so different than normal North-South conflicts that it took on a life of its own with all sorts of properties. But in effect, the basic logic is not very different from Grenada or Nicaragua or Chile or a ton of other places you can mention. It takes a weekend to overthrow the government of Grenada and maybe 70 years to get rid of the rotten apple somewhere. That's a sixth of the world. But it happened finally, just relative force had its effects. None of this necessarily has anything to do with human rights or freedom or anything. Easy to prove that. And I won't waste your time on it because it's too obvious, but it finally ended. The Cold War was over around 1989, 1990, and since then, not at all unpredictably, Eastern Europe is going back to being the third world by very specific design. There's a huge social engineering project called free market. It's got nothing to do with economics, which is driving Eastern Europe, trying to reconstruct the traditional Third World order. It's not true for all of Eastern Europe. There were parts of it that were part of the industrial West, like Western Poland, and which was part of Germany, and the Czech Republic, which was a rich industrial society, and they're going back to what they were. But most of the region is going back to what it was, deeply impoverished Third World countries with super rich elites, mostly the old Communist Party, who are rich beyond their wildest dreams and are the real victors in the Cold War along with their Western counterparts. But for the general population, it's just standard Third World misery, increasingly. Well, one effect of the return of this huge part of the Third World is to put new weapons into the hands of the masters in the West. And they're not at all shy about telling you that, if you read the right journals, like the Business Press, which is rather frank. So the world's leading business journal, and incidentally, quite a good journal, the London Financial Times, a couple of years ago they were talking about the horrible mess in Eastern Europe after the collapse of what is ludicrously called communism. They had a big story with a headline that said, "Green shoots in communism's ruins," meaning the whole thing is a total disaster, but there's a few good things going on. And the green shoots turned out to be that with, as they put it, with the pauperization and unemployment caused by the reforms. You're supposed to like these things, so they're called reforms. You don't call Hitler's measures reforms. Reforms is used for changes you're supposed to like, however destructive they may be. In fact, whenever you see the word reform, remember, you got to decode. So they say one of the results of the reforms is the pauperization and unemployment of Eastern European workers, which is great because that means that Western investors can now get workers at 10% the cost of what they called the pampered Western workers and without benefits. And as Businessweek chimed in happily, this means that the pampered Western workers are going to have to abandon their luxurious lifestyles because, after all, Volkswagen and General Motors and so on can just move a couple miles across the border and get people who really are beaten down and will work for 10% the wages and no benefits. And in case they get into trouble, the new democratic governments have highly repressive rules to ensure that those guys don't do things like form unions or ask for money or something like that. And since, remember, nobody believes in the free market except for someone else, that's another point. When General Motors or VW invest in Czechoslovakia or Poland, they make sure they get plenty of state protection, high tariffs to ensure them, domestic monopolies, big subsidies, the usual stuff that you get when you invest in the Third World in the free market, as it's called. So that's another weapon in the hands of the masters to beat down the pampered Western workers with their luxurious lifestyles. Well, that again has contributed. It's again pretty frank. In some way, it goes the other way too. So it's not just we invest there; people invest here. Large parts of the United States are now treated by the international economy as basically third world. So, for example, Daimler-Benz, the biggest conglomerate in Germany, a couple of years ago, put up a big Mercedes plant in Alabama, where they get standard third world conditions. You don't have to worry about unions, a lot of protection, state gives you a big subsidy. In fact, this was so outlandish, that agreement, that even the Wall Street Journal was critical of it. They're rarely critical of foreign investment. So it goes on. And that's a way of beating down the wages of the pampered German workers, who American workers now have some of the lowest. I think they're kind of always oscillating up and back with England. I'm not sure who's in first place now as to where the lowest labor costs are. U.S. used to have the highest about 10 years ago, as you'd expect in the richest country in the world, but a couple of years of Reaganism beat it down to the lowest, and I think England went even below. So last time I looked, about 60% the wages of German workers, and much worse benefits and fewer protections and so on. So Daimler-Benz can hit German workers over the head not only by moving to Poland, but even by moving to Alabama. That's what's called a globalized economy, and it works here too. There were big strikes the last year or two, a couple of years. There have been major labor actions in Decatur, Illinois, old working class town, where three transnationals were determined to destroy the last remnants of American industrial unionism, and they won, hands down. Bitter struggle. No way to get any support for it or even knowledge about it. They tried really hard, the Decatur workers. Even places like Boston, people just wouldn't show up when they came for support meetings. It was shocking. Including the left, I should say. But in any event, they lost. The first union to collapse was the subsidiary of a Japanese-owned transnational rubber company. The next one was Caterpillar. The last one was Staley, a subsidiary of Tate & Lyle, British transnational, which made its money in the slave trade and has been doing similar things since. The Caterpillar was the one U.S.-based one, just one, in what the business press called a rout. They totally smashed the UAW. It had to capitulate to the original, very harsh Caterpillar proposals. Caterpillar, remember, these are totalitarian institutions, so it used its power to impose real Stalinist-style rules. You're not allowed to talk in the factory. You're not allowed to wear the wrong kind of T-shirt. You're not allowed to mention strike or say anything bad about management. Again, even the Wall Street Journal was a little surprised at this level. But they won, and through the strike, they'd explained why they were going to win. First of all, they were making huge profits. Secondly, they had used those profits for a certain business strategy, namely they had invested in overseas facilities, not for reasons of profit, it's counter to profit, but to give them excess capacity. So in case workers in Decatur, Illinois try to maintain the rights that were finally won 60 years ago, they can just shift to production in Brazil and wherever they happen to have their plants, maybe Poland, and that'll fulfill the markets, and that'll hit the workers over the head. Same right here in Boston. I think the biggest manufacturer in Boston is Gillette, and they announced to the business press that they're pursuing exactly the same business strategy. In fact, they're even building excess capacity in Germany, where labor costs are way higher than here, just in case Boston workers get out of control, and then you can fill the orders in the European market from the higher cost German workers. That's incidentally one of the many ways in which far-sighted businessmen arrange policies that happen to be counter to profit but have a longer-term class interest involved. Well, these are among the many ways in which it now becomes possible to globalize the economy to bring the third world home. And the U.S. more and more looks like a third world society. I mean structurally. It's so rich that it's not going to look like Egypt. But the structure is very obvious. You can't walk through any American city without, let alone rural areas, without seeing it. There are sectors of enormous growing opulence. Most of the wealth, there was low growth in the last years, but there was some growth. Almost all went to the very top few percent. For most of the population, income either stagnated or in fact declined. The differences are radical. And as in the main third world, there's a growing class of useless people. They don't contribute to profit making. There's nothing much to do with them. We're a civilized society, so we don't send out death squads. We have a different technique. We throw them to prisons. Either we try to lock them up in urban slums, which are kind of concentration camps, or just toss them in the can. Crime hasn't changed much in the last 20 years. But the perceptions of crime that have been manipulated by the doctrinal system, they have changed a lot. And so has incarceration. It approximately tripled during the Reagan years with no growth in crime, and it's going up even faster now. The U.S. long ago left its major competitors behind, South Africa and Russia. We now lock up more of our population, proportional population, than I think any country in the world, certainly more than any industrial country. And it's going up, and up very fast. That's without any change in crime. It's commonly claimed that the U.S. has unusually high crime rates, so we've got to do something about it. Even that's not true. Statistics of international statistics only recently become available, and they're not entirely comparable because slightly different measures are used. But it turns out that U.S. crime rates are, although they're at the high end of the industrial societies, they're not off the scale. In fact, they're usually not even at the top. There's one category of crime where the U.S. is indeed off the scale, and that's homicides in the course of anything, family arguments to robbery. If you look at homicides with guns, it's way off the spectrum in the United States, but that has nothing to do with crime rates. That has to do with the fact that this is the only country at least the only Western country where it's considered, where there's tremendous pressure to allow people to run around waving guns at each other. So naturally, there's a lot of deaths from guns. But if you put that aside, U.S. crime rates are at the high end, but not very unusually so, and not even at the top. The imprisonment does get rid of a large part of the population. just this morning, the papers reported that in California, about 40% of the black population is largely targeted against blacks, although they sort of come in a way naturally because of the race-class correlation, which is fairly close, but it's specifically targeted against blacks on top of that. 40% of, I think they said 40% of black males between 20 and 30 are in the criminal system in California, either on parole or in jail or something like that. That's a good way to destroy a population. That's the main purpose, certainly, of the so-called drug war, which, again, has virtually nothing to do with drugs, but has an awful lot to do with locking up parts of the population you want to get rid of. And you have to control them somehow. It doesn't matter whether you're a totalitarian state or a democratic state, you somehow have to control them. And there aren't a lot of ways to do that. So everyone hits the same methods, whether their name is Adolf Hitler or something else. Because there aren't a lot, you can't think of many methods, so you always get the same ones. And one of them is to just instill fear and hatred and anger and hatred of the guy next door, or somebody who looks a little different or something like that. That's a terrific technique of social control. And inspiring fear of crime. Crime is real and dangerous, but like I say, it's not unchanged and it's not off the spectrum. Instilling fear of crime, and in particular when you can associate that with somebody really bad, like black crime, and that's what's done very consciously. Sometimes ludicrously, like in the Willie Horton type propaganda, but it's the same as done with welfare. Instill hatred and fear, and those bad guys over there, fortunately another color, so easy to hate and that sort of thing. And plenty of history behind it, as I need not tell you. That's a technique of social control for the whole population. So crime is incarcerating the population has a lot of side benefits. It also you make a lot of money out of it. With the growth of the prison system, that's a piece of the state system, so it's the state economy. And it does give a kind of Keynesian stimulus to the economy. The big investment firms like Merrill Lynch and so on float bonds for tax-free bonds for prison construction. The construction industry makes a lot of money. By now, prison labor is shooting up. That's good, not only because it's very cheap labor, you don't have to worry about unions and benefits and that sort of thing, or even wages, but it also has the nice side effect of undermining wages elsewhere. Because when you can produce things with slave labor, then it has a natural effect in lowering wages elsewhere. It's even gotten to the scale where high-tech industry is getting interested. About a year and a half ago, the Wall Street Journal had a story on how high-tech firms are beginning to recognize that there's another ripoff out there alongside the Pentagon to get the public to pay your costs. You can invent, crazy surveillance systems with supercomputers and implanting electrodes in people and so on and so forth. And that's a way of getting the public to pay the costs of research and development and so on, which is primarily what the Pentagon's for. It's not the scale of the Pentagon, but growing fast, in fact. People talk about the threat of the explosion of healthcare. Well, yeah, it's true because of our utterly incompetent, inefficient, privatized healthcare system, which has the highest administrative cost in the world and so on. But security systems growing even faster, and consciously and purposely, because that's a good one. That puts money into the right buckets, as well as getting rid of the wrong part of the population. So that's just another aspect of bringing the third world home, and a very important one for its human consequences. Well, let's look at another aspect of the doctrinal system. One of the things that's supposed to be going on is a great new era of free trade. Well, here there's both a kind of descriptive and a normative side to it, that is what's happening and is it good or bad. The descriptive side is that we're in a period of liberalization and open markets and free trade and all that kind of stuff. And on this, even the critics agree. So if you read the critics of what's called neoliberalism or, IMF and so on, they agree, we're moving into a period of free trade. Then there's the normative side, which says it's a great thing. That even has a name. It's called the Washington Consensus. Meaning U.S. government and the World Bank and the IMF and all the guys that matter. So the Washington Consensus says that the path to development and growth and prosperity is free markets and all that kind of stuff. Well, let's take a look at the descriptive side. Is there an increase in free markets, like say trade? Well, I already mentioned one small aspect of that you have to bear in mind. What's called trade is, to a large extent, corporate mercantilism. But when you look at the whole system, you have to remember that there's a difference between free market doctrine and what you might call really existing free market doctrine. That is the way it really works. And the way it really works is and always has been double-edged. means free markets for you, but not for me. It's like VW and GM. Yeah, you guys over there, you have market discipline, but we get protection. That's history. That goes back to the British in India, the whole history of U.S. development. In fact, every developing society, every developed society has used that method. We ram liberalization down the throats of people we control, but we have a developmental state with high protective tariffs and plenty of state intervention and so on and so forth. If there's anything that's general in economic history, it's that. You ask why India looks different from England or why India looks different from the United States. That's essentially the reasons, large part of them. No time to talk about these details, but that's absolutely true. Just to give you an example of how, if it's not true, it's well known. So if you look at the standard economic historians, they point out that it's an utter myth that free trade has been the engine of growth. In fact, historically, protectionism has been the engine of growth, and liberalization has been a device that has driven the third world into its present form. The differences between the first and third world weren't very great in the 18th century. In fact, sometimes they were reversed from today. But now they're huge, and this is one of the, maybe the most important of the factors. Just, you might notice, just to illustrate, that outside of Europe, there's two parts of the world that developed, namely the United States and Japan and its region. The rest were smashed. Those also happen to be the two parts of the world that resisted colonialism. The U.S. took the path toward independence, and Japan was able to resist colonial aggression. As a result, the U.S. and later Japan and other countries of Europe were able to follow the British model. That is very high protection, powerful state, strong intervention into the economy, and ramming liberalization down the throats of your colonies like India, U.S. and Japan. Japan didn't do it, interestingly, for its colonies. It developed them, unlike the West, which is why Korea and Taiwan are newly industrializing countries. But those are the regions that developed, the ones that were subjected to what is now called the Washington Consensus. Yeah, that's India, Egypt, Africa, Philippines, most Latin America, and so on. Well, a lot to talk about here. Time's short. I'll come back if you like. And this is exactly the same today, just coming to today. The Financial Times a couple of weeks ago had reviewed a big new study of the 100 top transnational corporations on the Fortune list of transnationals. Turns out of the top 100, 100 of them, that is all, had benefited from interventionist policies of their own government to protect them, and 20 of the 100, according to the study, would not have survived if it had not been for massive state intervention, meaning taxpayer subsidy, like when Reagan rescued Lockheed or Continental Bank of Illinois and so on. That's 20 out of 100 which survived because of state intervention, and 100 out of 100 that have benefited from it. You see this pretty dramatically right in the United States in recent years. So the Reagan administration was full of talk about the wonders of the market, but to the business community they were talking a different line. There they were boasting that they were more protectionist than any post-war administration, which was an understatement because, in fact, they were more protectionist than all post-war administrations combined. They had doubled import barriers, meanwhile pouring public funds into private industry, largely through the Pentagon funnel. And, in fact, that's the reason why the U.S. has a steel industry and computers and, in fact, virtually every functioning part of the economy was reconstructed, would have been wiped out by Japanese competition if free markets had been allowed. But it was free. Japanese imports were barred effectively, and money was poured in to allow U.S. industry to recapitalize. Right now, you'll notice that we're supposed to be in a budget crunch and everything's being cut, like, funds for school lunches and so on. Not everything's being cut. One thing's going up, namely the Pentagon. That's going up, and the Heritage Foundation, the big conservatives say, yeah, that's got to go up. Not because we're facing any threat. I mean, talk about the U.S. facing threat isn't even a joke. But it's because people who live in, say, Cobb County, Georgia, are facing a threat. It's Newt Gingrich's district, which gets more federal subsidies than any remotely comparable one in the country. Well, Newt Gingrich is the biggest welfare freak in the country by far, and to keep his rich constituents even richer, you have to make sure that the nanny state pours money into their pocket, and the Pentagon is the main way that's done, so that budget has to go up. tough love and all that kind of stuff is fine for 7-year-old kids who have to learn responsibility if they're hungry, but not for rich folk in Cobb County. If they were subjected to market discipline, they'd be out selling rags or something. But as long as they've got the nanny state pouring money into their pockets, they're doing just fine, and therefore the Pentagon budget has to go up, as it's doing. This has gotten to the point where the business world itself has even forgotten what capitalism is supposed to be. Like the Wall Street Journal had a front page lead story a couple of weeks ago in which they were comparing two states and their business strategies, Virginia and Maryland. We're talking about how they had of course, both trying to be very business friendly and support entrepreneurial values and all that sort of thing, but they did it in slightly different ways, and it was comparing these ways. Well, you look closely, it turns out it's not Virginia and Maryland. It's the parts of Virginia and Maryland that are suburbs of Washington. And in fact, the two ways that they had picked were in fact slightly different. Maryland had tried to develop biotechnology, figuring that the biggest cash cow was going to be the National Institute of Health, and Virginia had been concentrating on high tech, figuring the biggest cash cow is going to remain the Pentagon. So their different business strategies were which part of the public sector can we rip off? And it turned out that Virginia was a little better in its entrepreneurial values, so they were doing better. As I say, these guys don't even remember what capitalism was supposed to be. What it is market discipline for poor people, third world, of course, and poor people at home, but plenty of protection for us. And if we get into trouble, you bail us out. Be hard to find an exception to this, and in fact, it goes right through history. Well, let me just briefly comment on the normative side, and then I'll stop. There's a normative aspect to the Washington Consensus, namely it's supposed to be a great thing. Well, there is some evidence, like a couple hundred years of history, which happens to be on the other side, but that's just facts. So let's put aside the facts and just look at the theory, which is what's important. There's a recent article on this, which I really urge that you look at. It's by one of the real leading lights of modern economics, Paul Krugman, very smart guy, one of the real hotshots, and pretty interesting stuff. It's an article that appears in International Affairs. That's the Journal of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and it's in their 50th anniversary issue, so a very big, prestigious publication a couple of months ago. Krugman makes basically 4 points. His first point is that this is his field, incidentally. He's the top expert on international trade theory and all that kind of stuff. He says, first thing we have to remember is that we don't really know what's going on. There's no economic theory that has much to say about questions like development and that sort of thing. He counsels humility. Just let's admit we don't know much. Second point he makes is, at any moment of time, he runs through recent history, last 50, 60 years, at any moment, economists and public intellectuals are supremely confident about what the proper method of development is. That's point 2. Point 3 is, 20 years later, it's reversed. It's the opposite that turns out to be the right method, and they're still equally confident. So you're always supremely confident, but there's cycles about what you're confident about, and nobody really knows what's going on anyway. The fourth point that he makes, which is really just one line, is he says toward the end, he says, well, some people say that these positions are taken because it serves the interests of powerful people and institutions. He says, doubtless that's true, and doubtless that's the whole story. So if we take the throwaway line and we spell it out, we have pretty much a picture of the way it works, and incidentally what people are being trained to do in the good colleges, places like this and MIT and so on. You have to not notice what's going on in the world and just remember these lessons. Unmentioned is that there have been massive experiments, big social engineering experiments conducted on experimental animals who can't answer back for a couple hundred years. It goes back certainly at least to what was called the permanent settlement in India back in 1793 when the British totally reorganized the place, and it goes right up till today. The experiments in Eastern Europe, structural adjustment in the third world, stuff that's being done here, and for the urban population, so on. Huge experiments, not based on any knowledge, of course, but with tremendous effects. And there's some very striking consequences if you look at these experiments. They're almost always what are called failures, and in fact recognized to be, like the permanent settlement in India, which just totally changed the place and put it under landlord control. The British did do an analysis of it about 50 years later, and they realized, it's a total disaster for the population. But they did point out that it had some good sides. Like it created an Indian upper class, which had a stake in British rule. And it created devices to control the rest, and although they didn't say it, it enriched the right people in England. And that's a very typical aspect of the experiments. The designers always seem to do fine. In fact, if you can find an exception, it'd be interesting. But the people who designed and conducted the experiment, it turns out to be very successful for them. It's often a disaster for everyone else, but that's kind of incidental. Maybe they gain, maybe they lose, but it's sort of incidental. The one thing that's a constant is that the experimental designers do a fine job. And incidentally, the experimental animals, they don't sign any release forms. They're just the wrong end of the gun, so therefore they can be experimental animals. Well, that's another sort of pretty universal feature of modern history. There's more to talk about about myths, but I'm way over time. So let me just make a final comment. There's nothing new about the period we're in now. I mean, it's a very ugly and grim period for most of the population, and in fact getting worse. It's a big attack on democracy, even on markets, if you look closely, and certainly on rights. It's not the first time. There was a period which was called the gay 90s, you remember, exactly 100 years ago. It was really gay for a little percent of the population who were just doing fine. For most of the population, it was a total disaster. There was a big emigration of farmers from the central United States to Canada because they couldn't take it anymore. Urban workers were getting smashed by the state security forces, murdered. Unions are being destroyed. Around Pittsburgh, Homestead, Pennsylvania, it was 50 years before they were even willing to talk to people. I was talking to some labor organizers recently. One of them comes from there. He says when you talk to 80-year-old people, they still are afraid to talk to you because of the totalitarian structure that was imposed by force on the major industrial areas. That was the gay 90s. Well, it wasn't the end. Struggles continued, changes took place, and they made a lot of progress. In the 1920s, it looked even more extreme than now. It looked as if it was going to be, they were talking about, the end of history, perfection, total control by the business classes, no labor role in anything, no democracy, just control in the right hands. Well, it turned out not to be quite true. In the 1930s, there was mass popular mobilization. The United States was, in fact, shifted sort of into the mainstream of industrial society with the New Deal. That set off a huge counterattack, which has been going on since and has been accelerating in the past 20 years. And in a way, we're sort of back to the 20s in some respects. But, this has been going on over and over again. It's the end if you decide that it's the end. Other than that, these are very fragile institutions. They have no particular legitimacy, in fact, none in my opinion. And there's no reason why why the shadow can't be attenuated and why the substance can't be directly attacked. But that's a matter of choice, not any kind of law, whether of either physics or economics, to be ludicrous. Okay, I'll stop.
Right. 1996 is also the 50th anniversary of the war crimes trials. We're getting ready to undertake some war crimes trials in what was known as Yugoslavia. You've mentioned Richard Milhouse Nixon tonight quite a bit, one of our major war criminals here in America. Would you like to make some comments about war crime trials and whether or not they're a myth or a reality?
War crimes trials the people who are coming under trial in former Yugoslavia, they deserve trial. They're war criminals. And the original war crimes trials in Nuremberg, those guys were maybe some of the world's worst criminals. Tokyo, it's not so obvious. There was a Tokyo tribunal too, and that's a more mixed story. However, there's one thing about war crimes trials. In fact, it was established as Nuremberg. Are you hearing me? Yeah? Yeah? Mike sounds like I'm not hearing it. Are you hearing me? Yes or no? No. Well, somebody know what happened? Any high-tech wizards around here? I'll talk as loud as I can. The basic principle of war crimes trials was in fact laid down at Nuremberg, very explicitly. A crime was defined at Nuremberg as a crime that they committed and that we didn't commit. And that was explicit. So it was considered a defense at Nuremberg if you could show that the Americans and the British did the same thing. Like one of the major, Admiral Dönitz, one of the major German Nazi submarine commanders, had a successful defense. He brought an American naval commander and said, yeah, we did the same thing. Urban bombing, which was massively destructive, was not considered a crime. The reason is because the U.S. and Britain ended up doing way more of it than anyone else. And in fact, if you run through the list, that was pretty explicit. There were real crimes they were tried for, but a subpart of the crimes that you couldn't say the West committed. That generalizes. Criminals who are brought to trial are the ones who lose. The ones who win are never brought to trial. The ones who are in fact, we don't have to go back very far to see that, much short of war crimes trials. There happens to be one major country that was condemned by the World Court for aggression, technically, for the unlawful use of force. That was just 9 years ago. The reaction to that was that the government, it happens to be us, the Congress reacted to that by increasing instantly the unlawful use of force, increasing the funding for the terrorist forces attacking Nicaragua in this case, that the U.S. was condemned for and ordered by the World Court to stop. Furthermore, the aid to them, which the World Court determined was not humanitarian aid, was military aid, continued without end, right to the end, always called humanitarian aid. You can check the press and the journals and so on and see if aid to the Contras in 1989 was ever called military aid. You'll find it was 100% of the time called humanitarian aid. In fact, the decision of the World Court was never even reported on these issues. The World Court does not condemn the United States. In fact, the reaction to the World Court decision across the board was that the decision discredited the World Court, which must be under Russian control or something like that. They literally said that. It's a Harvard professor, quoted in the Washington Post. So the World Court was simply dismissed because it's saying the wrong thing, bringing the wrong people before the bar of justice. And that's what war crimes trials are. It's not that they're wrong, but one of the principles of the law is supposed to be that it's not selective. And by that standard, it's not even a comedy.
Our news media and educational establishment are pretty much either in the hands of or easily affected by the super rich, which are controlling a lot of what you're talking about in the world's capital flow and in industry. Have there been known yet any particularly effective models for either destabilizing the news and educational media from being in the hands of the super rich?
Very well known.
Particularly effective models?
Sure, very well known. We've done them in our own experience. In fact, I'm very critical of the media, but they're a lot better than they were 30 years ago. Much more open, there's much less coverage, because they're trying to cut down news coverage. But if you look at them, the kinds of things that come up in the media today, you couldn't have imagined coming up 30 years ago. Well, there's reasons for that. The main reasons are that it reflects the cultural changes in the general population since the 60s. There was a lot of ferment in the 60s, but it really expanded in the 70s. If you look at the big popular movements, they're mostly from the 70s. The environmental movement, the feminist movement, the solidarity movements, and so on. They expanded even farther in the 80s, got much bigger, deeper rooted, and that had its effects in many ways. For one thing, people in the media, a lot of them came through those formative experiences. They were changed like everybody else was changed. For another thing, any institution is going to have to reflect, even in a totalitarian state, the institutions are going to have to reflect what's going on among the public in some way, in a more democratic society like ours in many ways. Beyond that, there's all sorts of, there's certainly a possibility of creating alternative media. Radio Free Maine is what we have, but in other places they have a lot more. Actually, Boston is an unusual city in that it doesn't have community-based media. A lot of places do, most. And I travel around the country a lot, and you see the difference. You see the difference in a community that has a community-based radio. Boston happens to be a pretty active city, but it's very isolated, fragmented, no communication and so on. Well, partly because we don't have community-based media, but they're possible. Take, say, cable television. That offers endless opportunities, and it's just that people aren't using them. And a lot of other things like that. So sure, plenty of strategies. Quite beyond that, let me just say that a little over the horizon is the question why you should have corporate media altogether. What right do private tyrannies have to dominate the communication system? Well, answer, they don't have any more right than Bolshevism and fascism.